How would you like to make a quilt that was done after one block? This is the Northern Glow Quilt Pattern, and it's a one-block quilt. It's based on the Wyoming Valley quilt block, and whether you make the throw size or the baby or the wall hanging size, there's just one block. Today we're going to be making this throw size in these pretty Christmassy colors. This pattern is easily customizable to whatever color scheme you can dream up. Leave a comment for me and let me know what color scheme you would use. Maybe you'd make it in winter colors or some pastel baby colors, or make it patriotic, or use some really fun prints. Let me know how you'd make this pattern. So follow along. I think you're really going to like this tutorial. These are the fabrics I'll be using today. They're all Art Gallery Fabric Pure Solids. The names are White Linen, Rosemary, Hunter Fields, and Candied Cherry. We'll start by making some flying geese blocks using the 4 at a time method. We need 4 smaller squares of fabric 1 and 1 large square of fabric 2. Mark a diagonal line from corner to corner on each of the smaller squares. Then set 2 small squares aside and line up the remaining 2 small squares with the opposite corners of the large square. Since these pieces are large and a little tricky to keep in line, we're going to pin them in place. Then sew 1/4 inch away from the marked line on both sides of the line. Cut on the marked line and press the seam allowances toward the smaller squares. Now, take the remaining 2 smaller squares and line them up with the corners of the new pieces. Pin them in place and sew 1/4 inch away from the marked line on both sides of the line. Cut on the marked line again and press the seam allowances toward the smaller squares. Now it's time to trim our flying geese. The first thing we do is make sure the point of the triangle is 1/4 inch away from the edge of the block. Trim off the extra, then turn the block around and trim the block to the right width. Next, we want to trim the length, making sure that the tip of the triangle stays centered on the block. Trim the length from both sides, centering the point. We'll end up with 4 flying geese of this fabric combination. Now we're going to repeat the process with the opposite fabric combo. This time, the large square will be fabric 1 and the smaller squares will be fabric 2. Follow the same steps for creating the flying geese blocks. You're going to end up with 4 flying geese of each color combo. Sew 1 flying geese block of each color combination together, forming a square block with a V shape of fabric 1 with a fabric 2 background. Repeat this with all the flying geese blocks to form the 4 side blocks of the quilt. Now we'll move on to the center block. This block is made with the square in a square method. We start with 2 smaller squares of fabric 3 and 1 large square of fabric 4. Cut the smaller squares in half diagonally. Working on 2 opposite sides at a time, pin the triangles to the sides of the large square, matching the centers by making sure that an equal length of the triangle tips overhang on each end of the square. Pin and sew the first 2 triangles in place and press the seam allowances open. Repeat with the remaining 2 triangle pieces. Then we'll trim the block to size, keeping a 1/4 inch between the points of the square and the edge of the block. This completes the center block. The large fabric foursquare in the center of the block will be the very center of the quilt. Since it's quite large and offers a focal point, it's a great place to use some fussy cutting or embroidery or even a little applique. If you're planning something like this, remember that this square will be set on point as a diamond in the quilt. I'm going to be doing some fancy quilting in this square later, so I'm just using a plain fabric square for now. Now, we'll move on to the corner blocks. We're going to start by making some half square triangles using the 8 at a time method. Using one large square each of fabrics 3 and 4, we'll place them right sides together and mark 2 lines diagonally from corner to corner. Sew a 1/4 inch away from both sides of both lines. Now cut on both lines to create 4 triangles, and then cut all 4 of these triangles in half through the center to form 8 half square triangles. Press the seam allowances open and trim the blocks to size. We need 4 more HSTs for the corner blocks, and we'll make them using the 4 at a time method. This method can be a little tricky because the edges end up being cut on the bias, so handle them with care and consider starching the squares of fabric before starting. Arrange the squares of fabric 3 and 4 right side together and pin them. Sew a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the square on all 4 sides. Then cut the square in half diagonally twice. Press the seam allowances open and trim the HSTs to size. Now we're ready to assemble the corner blocks. Using 2 of the 8 at a time HSTs, 1 of the 4 at a time HSTs, and a fabric 2 block, lay out the corner block. Make sure your 4 at a time HST is the one diagonally opposite from the fabric 2 block. If you have any prints in your fabrics, this will help to align them symmetrically around the quilt. Sew the squares together into 2 rows and press the seam allowances open. Then sew the rows to each other, matching the seam, and press the seam allowances open again. You will have 4 corner blocks. Now we'll assemble the quilt center. Lay out the side, corner, and center blocks as shown in the pattern. Sew the blocks together into rows and press the seam allowances open. Sew the rows to each other, matching and pinning the seams. Press the seam allowances open again. Now we're going to finish the quilt top by adding a beautiful mitered border as a frame. Cut the strips of fabric 1, 3, and 4. Sew them each end to end into one long strip of each fabric, and then cut them to the required lengths. Line up a strip of fabrics 1, 3, and 4 and pin and sew them together, forming a strip set. Press the seam allowances open. You will need 4 matching strip sets. Fold each strip set in half and press to find the center point. Now, prepare the quilt top by marking a point 1/4 inch in from the corner on the back side of the quilt on all 4 corners. You'll never sew past this point. Line up one border strip with the edge of the quilt, matching the center point of the border with the center of the quilt. Pin and sew the border to the quilt, starting and ending the seam at the marked 1/4 inch points. Press the seam allowance toward the border and repeat this process on the opposite side of the quilt. Pin the extending tails of the border back on themselves to keep them out of the way. And then sew the remaining 2 border strips on in the same way. You'll start and end the seams at the same points where you started and ended the previous 2 border seams. Now you have 2 seams converging on each point, and eventually you're going to have 3 seams coming into each point, forming a Y seam. Press the seam allowances toward the border and unpin the excess border tails. Lay the borders out, crossing one border over the other. Working on one corner at a time, fold the top border under at a 45-degree angle until it lines up with the border underneath, with the right sides together. Make sure the stripes match, then press the angle firmly into the border. Pin the borders together near the crease and fold the quilt in half diagonally. You're going to sew on that creased line. You can see the border seams that end at the 1/4 inch dot Fold the seam allowances on both sides up and out of the way and pin them in place temporarily so you can see that 1/4 inch dot clearly. You're going to sew only to that dot, meeting the other seams that originate at that dot, forming the Y seam. After you sew, take the pins out and then open up your corner to double check and see if your seams align, if the corners align. If you're happy with the way they meet up, then trim off the excess, about 1/4 inch away from the seam. Press the mitered corner seam open, then press the border seam over the top of the corner seam toward the border. Repeat this process on all 4 corners. Give everything a good pressing and your quilt top is finished. Quilt and bind as you choose for a beautiful finished quilt. Thanks for joining me today for the Northern Glow Quilt tutorial. If you'd like to make your own quilt, you can find the pattern on shadowvalleyquilts.com. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.